The Rare Slot Podcast is part of the Booster Pack Network. For more TCG-related content, visit theboosterpacknetwork.com. Hosting for this show is sponsored by Category 1 Games, the go-to shop for all of your classic TCG needs. Find your favorites or discover something new at category1games.com.
Hello and welcome to Rare Slot. My name is Rands and this is the show on the Booster Pack Network where we can talk trading card game topics. Now, they might be topics decided on by me, they might be topics suggested by you guys, the listeners, or perhaps it's a topic about something that's happening in the world of trading card games at the time of this recording. Now, if this is your first time joining us, let me just simply say, welcome. But if you've joined us before, you're going to notice that there's been some changes recently to the network or the channel. Now, previously, this was simply just the Booster Pack podcast feed, but now it has metamorphosized into the Booster Pack Network. And what does that really mean? Nothing for the shows that you already love, really, but it does mean in the coming months and into next year, you're going to see some new trading card game focused shows from new creators also on this same channel. It just means more content for you to check out and see if you like, and if you love trading card games, this is the place to be. It also means that there's another change that's happened recently as well. As I mentioned, this used to just simply be the Booster Pack podcast. And these shows, the Rare Slot shows, used to just be the show's bonus episodes. But not anymore. Now that the Booster Pack podcast has been rebranded as Booster Pack Throwback elsewhere on this network, it's given us the opportunity to spin off Rare Slot into a show of its very own. Now, don't fret, it's still going to be the place where we have those free-form, casual conversations about trading card game-related topics, but it means we're going to be able to refocus on the format of the show itself. Perhaps that means we're going to have rotating hosts who can choose their own topics to talk about. Perhaps that means any number of other things might come to this show. If you have suggestions, I would love to hear them, but we'll cover that later on. Anyway, if you're interested in more about what's going on with the network, find that information elsewhere on the channel or on this feed. You can check that out later. Let's get back to this episode. Now, as for this episode, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, well, what exciting trading card game related topic do you have for this new trading card game focused talk show? Well, today we're going to be talking about role-playing games, damn it. Yes, really. Today we are going to take a look at the hobby gaming industry before the time of booster packs, deck boxes, and card sleeves. Although don't run away just yet, because of course I'm going somewhere with this. Yes, not only are we going to find about the origin story of tabletop role-playing games, but we're also going to find out about what happened to the industry when what some acolytes of RPGs have dubbed the collectible card game menace of the 1990s arrived on the scene. Anyhow, to help us navigate these wild waters of pre-collectible card game history, we have a very special guest, so let's introduce them. Yes, over the last many years, our guest has hosted the podcast Plot Points, which has given them the opportunity to talk about all manner of role-playing game-related topics. And recently, they have actually had a major non-fiction book titled Slaying the Dragon published about the origin story of Dungeons & Dragons, the very first role-playing game. In fact, it chronicles the shocking, riveting, and at times humorous story of TSR, which was the company that originally made Dungeons & Dragons. Now, full disclosure, I read this book on my way to Gen Con this year, and I gotta tell you, I was riveted by it. It was one of my absolute favorite reads I've read in a while. It's got a ton of great stories in it, and honestly, there was a couple of times that flights were delayed that, yes, I was disappointed, but I also loved the fact I got a chance to feast on the amazing tales within the pages of that book, even more when those flights were delayed. Okay, so enough gushing from me, because I could definitely recommend that book to anybody who's interested in that very essential sliver of gaming history, but we should introduce our guest. So, welcome to the Booster Pack, somebody who is a gamer, a teacher, a author, a fellow podcaster, and of course, a gaming historian. It is Ben Riggs. Ben, how do you do, bud?
Oh, you're making me blush here.
Well, I'm happy to do so.
But thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm delighted to be here to talk about role-playing games on a collectible card gaming podcast.
Well, it's all interconnected. I think I haven't run the numbers, but I would say probably a good third of the guests I've had on this show started their careers in tabletop games previously. Like just my previous two guests, I had somebody from Iron Crown Enterprises on who started working on Middle Earth before the CCG of that. and recently Peter Atkinson, who of course started Wizards of the Coast as a role-playing game company. So I would love to take a bite out of this slice of history, because gaming didn't start in 1993 with Magic the Gathering. So let's have you help us explore a little bit further back. But before we do, why don't you just give us a real quick overview of your personal gaming journey and what sort of led you to sort of exploring history in the way that you have and writing a book like this one?
So let's see. I started out with second edition Dungeons and Dragons, which certainly dates me. I didn't actually play a ton of it though, because I couldn't find anyone to play with. And then when I got to high school, everybody was playing Vampire the Masquerade or Call of Cthulhu or Rifts. So I spent most of my high school years, which overlapped kind of with the decline of TSR, playing again Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, Rifts. But I would say role-playing games were my primary. Mage the Ascension, a lot of Mage the Ascension. But role-playing games were my primary hobby at the time. College came. I discovered Legend of the Five Rings, which obviously CCG people will be very familiar with.
But you, of course, are talking about the role-playing version.
Yep. Some would even say the CCG may have ruined the RPG.
Now, that is a discussion I would love to get into, but that's another time, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's another hour-long conversation of minutia. I then traveled the world teaching for about 10 years. It was kind of hard to keep up with role-playing games when I was abroad. But it was still just something I was always really interested in. And thank God for the internet. At least I was able to listen to role-playing game podcasts during that time. Came back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, my home. Also the home of Wisconsin's the home of TSR. But I started writing for Geek and Sundry in 2016. And I got assigned a article, which was essentially, did you know Wizards of the Coast didn't always make Dungeons and Dragons? And that one article became 3. People started sending me functionally secret documents. Like somebody, when Peter Atkinson was buying TSR, he had a prep binder and he left it at TSR. An employee picked it up, held it for 25 years, and then mailed it to me. So like, the salary of everyone making Dungeons and Dragons in 1997 is in here. Letters from the co-creator of D&D asking to be put in charge of D&D in 1997 are in here. And again, I kept getting documents like this sent to me in the mail. And it's funny because like I never really wanted to write this book. But it really demanded to be written. It was like, hey, look, here's this story that you can't look away from. And when I started writing it, I was like, 10,000 people will be interested in this. There's 10,000 people for whom this is a unputdownable story. But I'm not sure if it's any bigger than that. But again, I got so lucky with D&D being bigger than it ever is right now. A major publisher got interested. And that's why you can now buy this book about the history of D&D in Barnes & Noble.
Now, it sounds a little bit, as we, love storytelling, we love sort of fantasy, we love that sort of genre sort of storytelling. It definitely sounds like you went on your very own hero's journey of sorts, the unwilling protagonist forced to write this tale. And there sounds like there's some amazing things in that binder you were just holding there. It sounds like some very fascinating information, more than some probably would want you to know. So let's jump into it though. So let's assume that the audience of this podcast knows, the broad strokes of sort of CCG history, but let's take them back to the very beginning of sort of fantasy role-playing, the beginning of Dungeons and Dragons, which was way back in the 70s. Tell us sort of like the origin story of what would become Dungeons and Dragons.
It started with a trading of ideas essentially between a guy named Gary Gygax, who was an unemployed insurance salesman making shoes part-time in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and Dave Arneson, who was a game designer that lived in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And Gary Gygax and another guy named Jeff Perrin made a game called Chainmail that allowed, one-on-one fantasy combat. And Dave Arneson took that and, inspired by another guy named Dave Wesley, told his players, okay, each of you is going to control only one person. The person is going to persist from session to session. They're going to gain experience as they go. Oh, and you're going to be exploring a dungeon. And he called it Blackmore. And he took that Blackmore game down to Lake Geneva, ran it for Gary Gygax, and Gary Gygax said, "This is amazing. You want to collaborate on a rule set," because Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson had collaborated before. Dave Arneson's only other published work was with Gary Gygax. And Dave Arneson sends Gary Gygax like 20-ish pages of rules. Gary sets about making them into a rule set. No other company will buy the game that he produces, because again, everyone thinks it's weird. They don't quite get it. Most of the game companies at that point were centered around, okay, we really sell miniatures. We're really miniature game companies, so we need rule sets so that we have a game to sell minis for. But I want to say, I forget the name of the company, but one game company Gygax had worked with before rejected Dungeons and Dragons because he thought no one would ever want to make their own dungeon. That was the logic. No one's going to want to do that. That's so much work.
Well, it's such a revolutionary idea, right? Like, you craft the game. You have somebody who crafts the game environment in and of themselves, and then obviously, you put players in it as well. It's as you described it before. It's hard to sort of get into, and it's hard to understand. When you're just a younger player and you've got nobody to sort of show you how it works. It is a near impossible concept to grasp,
and yet it's so easy if you watch people do it. And again, a thing I used to think was true is I thought role-playing games were going to die. I thought video games and the internet were going to kill them. And I was totally wrong, because really what happened was video games trained people to play role-playing games, and the internet was great for allowing you to watch other people play, so you knew how to do it by yourself. But yeah, like there was an article in the Pittsburgh newspaper, the name escapes me right now, but from the late 1970s, a guy from the Pittsburgh newspaper went down to the local role-playing game convention and tried to describe what was going on there. And he just burned column inch after column inch after column inch. And by the end of it, I don't know, I don't know if you could have understood what he was trying to explain. But if you watch Matt Mercer run game for 10-15 minutes, you're like, oh, I get it. Okay, I understand exactly what's going on here.
So yeah, it's like trying to explain how aviation works to somebody in the 1200s.
That's actually not a bad analogy at all, because it's so much easier to watch a plane fly. like if you sit down, you feel like, okay, here's how to build a plane. But if you watch the plane fly, it just becomes much more. That's a really, really good analogy. I'm stealing that. That's fantastic.
Feel free to. Exactly. So let's jump back to the story of Gary and Dave. So tell us about what happened. Nobody wants to publish this game where you want to make your own dungeon, or you've got pen and paper and everyone's sitting around talking in medieval English. Tell us about what happens with Gary after he's been rejected by so many publishers.
So finally, he decides to co-found his own company to make it, called Tactical Studies Rules, TSR for short. He gets a few friends on board, including his best friend, who sadly dies, I believe, the month Dungeons and Dragons is published.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, really, really sad. Like, the things that guy didn't see. His name was Don Kay. The game very slowly begins to take off. I want to say it took like 10 months to sell their first 1,000 copies, 5 months to sell their second 1,000 copies, and it kept growing exponentially until the early 1980s. Eventually the company came to be controlled by Gary Gygax, Kevin Bloom, and Brian Bloom. They hired Dave Arneson briefly in, I think, 1975. But it was a contentious and awful relationship. The relationship between Gygax and TSR and Arneson is going to be filled with recriminations, insults, lawsuits. Like, it's absolutely horrifying.
And there's some fascinating stories about that in your book. You dig into a lot of that in the stuff that you write, and it's really interesting to hear, not just about the history of gaming, but this this sort of business power dynamics by people who had been sort of involuntarily thrust into the world of business, and by consequence, success as well. It's really quite fascinating to read. Now, you mentioned in there that it sort of just took off exponentially. Let's talk about that, because Magic the Gathering 20 years later would do something similar by creating an entire new gaming genre. But tell us how D&D took off. Like, what were some of the causing factors that saw this role-playing game phenomenon take imaginations across the the country and then eventually the world?
Yeah, I think the ultimate cause is just its radical novelty, and even to this day, there's no, if in my humble opinion, as a huge role-playing game geek, um, there's perhaps nothing quite as good in life as being in a really good role-playing game campaign. Like, it makes the rest of your life better. Like, when you're not playing about it, you're anticipating what's going to happen next week. You're kind of excited about it. When you're playing it, you're enjoying it. And again, it's salt on life. And I think the reason it is because in addition to being so radically novel, it's a really great way to build community and get to know people. And so many modern technologies rip us apart, and put up walls and divide us and polarize us. But gaming, role-playing games do the exact opposite. They push people together. And again, another reason, this is Robin Laws talking now. Another reason that gaming is such a radical new medium is it's the only medium where you are both the creator and audience at the same time. And that is, in fact, intensely pleasurable, to be both the actor on the stage and the audience. And really, like, again, people often described it as addictive. And when the Satanic Panic hits, one of the reasons that it kept getting dinged was, moral panickers would be like, it's an addictive game. People will play it for days. They just want to play it for on and on and on and on and on. And again, that addictive quality is, I think, and people were addicted to being the audience and the writer at the same time. They were addicted to the freedom. And I think that's what drove the exponential growth of D&D. And it does remind me of a moment early in Wizards of the Coast history that Peter Atkinson told me about, which maybe he told you too. But he said the first play test decks of Magic showed up at his house, and he was like, okay, everybody, we're going to play test this. And productivity stopped for like a week or two. Like, nobody in the company did anything except play Magic for 1 to 2 weeks. And that was when Peter was like, I guess this is going to be big.
Well, I mean, just not to tangent on CCGs, but again, it sort of captured that same vibe. You could control your own destiny by building a deck, and then you could play it against other people and sort of, be the audience and the creator at the same time. And it reminds me of that famous line from Inception. A dreamer is also creating the dream at the same time that they're living it. And essentially, that's what it is. Role-playing games are that sort of dream come to life, a virtual reality before the technology existed.
Again, I would say I can certainly see the comparison there between a CCG, and you getting the pleasure of building your deck and then getting to take it out on the road and see how it plays.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this, the fact that it was so alien and so popular and so addictive, fed into the moral panic industry in both America and Canada, actually. And without getting too much sidetracked into the history of the Satanic Panic, which could take hours of our time by itself.
Again, another podcast for another day.
Yeah. A lot of people have said that the Satanic Panic helped TSR and Dungeons and Dragons because it made the product more famous. I would say that while that may have been true in the short term, and there may have been immediately after the Satanic Panic, there was exponential growth at TSR. But then there was a crash in 84, 85, 86. And the Satanic Panic did cost D&D a lot of distribution. Sears, Penny's, Walmart, all refused to carry Dungeons and Dragons because of the complaints of parents. And that, I think, means that in the long run, it was actually bad for the game.
Yeah, so tell us, like, obviously D&D sort of becomes this huge success, and it gets a lot of attention, both negative and positive. Negative from parents, positive from players, and stuff like that. And eventually, an industry grows up around it with other titles like Vampire, like Ars Magica, like a whole bunch of new titles throughout the '80s. Rolemaster, all sorts of different games. So tell us about like what happens to the industry. You mentioned before there that mostly it was miniatures, war games, and stuff like that. Tell us about how role-playing games sort of introduced themselves and sort of changed hobby gaming as people had known it before.
So a number of companies spring up to take advantage of this new medium. There is, again, TSR is very litigious and contentious. So there is people do have to tread carefully. And early on, again, Chaosium does a lot of fascinating work. Mark Miller's Traveler, of course, is fascinating and amazing. It is interesting, though, like Mark Miller sent me the sales numbers for Traveler, and at a time when TSR might sell 500,000 copies of something, a good product for Traveler was selling 15,000 copies.
There is definitely a scale of difference there.
Yeah, so even though you have this amazing blossoming of creativity, Dungeons and Dragons and TSR really still is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. And it's really hard to compete with that, and nobody does compete with that until Wizards of the Coast comes along.
Yeah, well, that's actually going to bring up a couple of questions. So before Wizards of the Coast, which starts in 1990, if people checked out my episode with Peter, tell me about like was there any other competition that even got close? You mentioned Traveler there was only doing 1,500 copies on a good release. Was there any other company that at any time before CCGs come along that was sort of giving TSR a run for money, or were they always the biggest dog in the yard?
Let me tell you a Jim Ward, Lisa Stevens story. So Jim Ward, it sounds like you already had on. And Lisa Stevens was the first employee at Wizards of the Coast. And Lisa Stevens worked at Lion Rampant, which made Ars Magica. And along with her, there was Jonathan Tweet, who would co-design 3rd edition D&D, and Mark Reinhagen, who would design Vampire the Masquerade. Like, pound for pound, Lion Rampant may have been the most brilliant role-playing game company that ever existed, ever. And I want to say it's at Origins in like 88 or 89. Ars Magica wins like, fan favorite game of the year. And according to all 3 people at Lion Rampant, Jim Ward shows up at the Lion Rampant booth, and he kind of looks over Ars Magica and he says, "Nice little game you've got here. If you ever get any bigger, we will destroy you," and then leaves.
Wow, that is a talk about friendly business practice, right?
Yeah. And Lisa, it's funny, like Lisa Stevens, Jonathan Tweet, and Mark Reinhagen all remember the story. I fact-checked that story with all of them. It's a bit Rashomon because they all tell it a little bit differently. But then I go to Jim Ward and I'm like, "So did this happen?" And he's like, "I have no memory of that at all. I don't even know what you're talking about." But when I talk to other people, they're like, "Classic Jim Ward." Like, that's exactly the guy he was. And it is kind of funny. Like, no one ever really got quite close to TSR. From what I can tell, like Shadowrun, BattleTech, the biggest other role-playing games you can think of, were probably actually only selling a fraction of D&D, and yet TSR constantly was concerned about competition, concerned about squashing competition. Again, they even wanted to try and squash Wizards of the Coast. The hope was that Spellfire would in fact squash Wizards of the Coast. Are you familiar with Spellfire? Do I need to tell your audience about Spellfire?
We will get to Spellfire in just a second, so I can't wait to dive into that. So I guess my question is, obviously, some of these fantastic games come out at the end of the 1980s, and ones that are winning awards and that are getting quite a bit of acclaim, and Dungeons and Dragons is starting to throw their weight around. But tell me just, as your general overview, not only as a player at the time, but also as a historian for these types of products, what was the health of sort of the role-playing game industry at the end of the 80s and early 90s? As we said, there's a bunch of new games coming out. Players are starting to fraction and splinter a little bit. I know your book mentions a ton of sales from that era. Tell me all about like sort of where role-playing game were in comparison to sort of the earlier years at that time in the early 90s, just before we have the collectible card games hit.
Role-playing games, the industry tends to be boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. Right now we're in a boom, and it's been booming for like really since 2009. This is the longest sustained period of growth right now in role-playing game history. As an industry, the role-playing game industry was never bigger than it was in the early 1980s until probably now. The volume of product TSR moved in the early 1980s is in the millions, and again, probably never was beaten until now. Even though the industry looked fairly healthy in the early 90s, it was on it. First of all, it wasn't as big as it was in the early 80s. Secondly, it was on the cusp of a crash. There was an early 90s role-playing game bust, which predated the release of Magic the Gathering. Wizards of the Coast was actually a victim of it. It's one of the reasons they ended their role-playing game lines. Peter Adkison loves to talk about that because he's like, anybody who says that we killed TSR is totally wrong, because our sales were declining before we ever put out Magic. We were only putting out role-playing game products and they weren't selling. And again, White Wolf people will tell you about it. They'll talk about how there was a contraction in the retail market and they got a bunch of returns from Walden Books and B. Dalton's here in America. But yeah, it's clear that in the early 1990s, people were just not picking up role-playing games, and the audience was shrinking until in the 97, 98, 99, 97, 98, it wasn't unusual for TSR to have more returns than sales of a product. And it wasn't really until third edition D&D was released that that game started to recover.
That's so interesting. Now, it's funny you mentioned Peter in there. Now, the reason that is interesting is because people who are listening to my episode with Peter, or maybe want to go back and listen to it, will remember that Peter actually mentioned something, that in those early days when they were making role-playing games, the reason he took the meeting that ended up leading to Magic the Gathering, which is an infractious story in itself. But the reason he took that meeting was because he started to realize that there wasn't that much money in role-playing games. There wasn't a sustainable business model there for Wizards of the Coast. He wanted to be a game entrepreneur, but he couldn't actually sustain it with role-playing games the way he saw it. So ultimately, that sort of drought sort of led him and pushed him to take the meeting that would lead to Magic the Gathering, which is really fascinating. Now, Magic lands in 1993 amongst this sort of backdrop of role-playing game, to use your term, bust there. And tell me what the response was from, the institutionalized sort of, again, shouldn't use that term, but the sort of the main sort of role-playing game companies when Magic hit the scene. Do you have any sort of insight into what their reaction to this new collectible game genre was, and how they ended up strategizing around it, if at all?
At TSR, I certainly have a lot to say. So TSR's response was incredibly complicated, and I'm sure psychologists could really go into the many reactions I heard.
Well, it's so interesting you say psychologists, because for the first time, their ego had really been rocked, to speak to what we were talking about before, as the big dog.
That's fair to say, because like the first employees that played it realized it was a work of staggering genius and that they needed to get into the market as quickly as possible. And even so, they didn't have any budget to do that. So they put out a game hastily conceived, with recycled art, that some people said this is Spellfire, and some people said it was so bad they thought it was an attempt to tank the CCG market. I don't know that I wouldn't say that.
I think that's giving them a little too much credit there.
Yeah. I think that, again, it was a product with zero budget, put out as quickly as was humanly possible, which frankly, again, was not a bad business instinct.
get to market while this boom is going on. And I mean, I recommend anybody who might be interested in why they didn't have any budgets to read that book. There's some fascinating history about why TSR only had a limited budget at certain times of the year. But we're digressing now. Please go on about TSR's strategy with Spellfire.
Yeah. So on the one hand, again, some people are like, this is genius. It's an entirely new genre of game. We need to get into it. And at the same time, Lorraine Williams, the CEO, hated Spellfire, hated the CCG category, hated Wizards of the Coast, and I'm also told personally hated Peter Adkison, who may be the nicest person in role-playing games that I can tell. I don't know if that's true of CCGs, but he seems pretty nice.
He would definitely make the top 3 list, I'm sure.
So it's pretty weird that, like, and I had people tell me that there were points at which Spellfire releases were like the only thing keeping TSR alive, and yet Lorraine hated making it, kind of punished people even for bringing it up, and it really was a this is all happening while TSR's sales are plummeting. They're essentially lying about their gross sales. They're pretending everything is amazing. They when Wizards of the Coast stops making role-playing games, they put out this smug and smarmy press release, like shoving it in Peter's face, like, yeah, you couldn't make it in role-playing games. Well, we just grossed $40 million a year, which is a lie in many ways. It's a lot, like, lie in more than one way. It was a lie because A, they didn't actually gross over 40 million. B, they actually grossed 38.6 million. And the only reason they could even say they grossed that was because they included loans in their bottom line.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to make money if you're going to borrow money and say it's profit. That's easy.
Well, it sounds like there was some toxic business practice that may have been let grow over the years at TSR, and definitely some of those are reflected in that book indeed. But let's jump back to this sort of 90s era and sort of how they were strategizing around. You mentioned they rushed out Spellfire, and sort of loathed this CCG genre. And I think a quote that you might have even had in your book, or I read somewhere, was that Lorraine Williams, who was head of TSR at the time, said that she didn't like Peter because of what his game had done to the hobby gaming industry, which is sort of what we're trying to capture here. We're trying to figure out what did happen to the gaming industry with the advent of CCGs. So, does you obviously are quite in the know about the sales of TSR. Do you think, from your personal opinion, that players jumped ship from role-playing games? Maybe they got sick of this sort of toxic business behavior and moved on to Magic. Give me your perspective on that.
I don't think so. Because, like, I think that was kind of the line for a while, was people like in Jim Ward even said it. That was his the first time I asked him why TSR failed, he said that Magic the Gathering essentially killed it in capitalist combat. They came along, and he specifically cited the speed of a Magic game. He's like, you could play a Magic game in less than an hour, and D&D would take at least 4 hours to play. So people started playing Magic the Gathering. But I find that explanation that Magic killed D&D to be a way of if you had any role in the death of TSR, it's a way of absolving you of fault. It's not that you made mistakes, it's that these other guys were better than you. So, capitalism, that's what happened.
Oh, and there was always the picture painted that it was a scam. It was only about rich kids, and there was no skill and all that sort of stuff. And obviously, there's varying degrees on the spectrum of opinion there, and for various good reasons, especially when you start to involve other trading card games outside of Magic. But I did want to ask, okay, so we see a change to the role-playing game industry, especially sort of Dungeons and Dragons, through this mid sort of 90s period, as Magic sort of solidifies as being the #1 hobby game. And at the same time, we're seeing changes to the way that the industry works. Like, there is a scale that now enters the industry that has never been seen before. Game shops are able to sell multiple boxes for hundreds of dollars each per month to different players. Whereas before, they would have been lucky that every 6 months a player bought a module, or, a campaign guide, or, a player's handbook. But all you really need is just one of those, and then you can go on from there, and a few photocopies and you're set. So tell me about how this sort of influx of, this high volume product affected role-playing games, and especially the industry around them, and what was expected from retailers to companies like TSR. How did that sort of readjust, their engagement with not only, hobby gamers, but hobby retail, hobby distribution.
So again, it fueled another boom, which led to another bust. As everybody jumped on, you could call it a fad, you could call it a bandwagon. But and again, there were good games, there were bad games. Clearly, man, those Netrunner players, they like. There's not like have you guys talked about Netrunner?
On this show only briefly with some people who sort of worked on it tangentially, but they are an indoctrinated group. They are very, very happy with their game, and they are very dogmatic about it.
Yeah, but again, like I mentioned it because Netrunner was one of those games that came out of that first boom, and yet here we are decades later, and people are still like passionate about Netrunner. It's had an amazing and tragic history, probably.
It has. Well, I mean, interestingly enough, the trademark's just been bought by Wizards of the Coast, so it might have an interesting history again.
Oh my god, that's crazy. So it just very briefly, so it was designed by Richard Garfield, same guy that designed Magic. And for your listeners, and shout out anything you want to, because again, I'm not a Netrunner historian, but the game was very well regarded. It kind of like faded away for a while. Then Fantasy Flight bought it, did amazing work with it from what I can tell, really built up a fan base, and then abandoned the game. And now you have these really rabid fan leagues. I want to say they're making their own cards and stuff.
Yeah. Well, shout out to Project Nacy, which I will link in the description just for the sake of it if you're interested in Netrunner, but that's another story indeed. But yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Peter mentioned that Richard once had the opinion that Netrunner was the best game he ever designed, a collectible card game or otherwise.
Yeah, and again, based on the passion of the people who play it, it doesn't surprise me to hear that. But then again, the reason I mentioned it is because again, so there is this boom where you do have role-playing game companies. Then okay, we're making a collectible card game, and again, there were good ones, there were bad ones, but there were a lot of them. And there is no doubt that money helped keep role-playing game companies alive, and I would think really helped game stores and helped them keep their doors open. So I would be of the opinion that it brought money into the hobby and into those game stores and into role-playing game companies. One of my laws of if you're going to start a role-playing game company, you cannot only make role-playing games. You have to make two products, because the business model for a role-playing game is a tragic one. You can sell a product once, and that is all you ever can sell it, really. God bless the beer makers. Their product gets consumed, and if someone wants to enjoy it again, they have to go buy it again. But if you want to play D&D, you just need to buy like one book once. If you buy the rules cyclopedia, you can play D&D for the rest of your life and never buy anything else.
Well, that goes to what we were saying before about collectible games. It has that similar sort of just one more time, that sort of lottery ticket sort of feeling as well. Or for whatever reason people are engaging with the game. I did want to just jump on something you said there, though. You said, a lot of companies sort of jumped on this bandwagon, and for many reasons, it kept some of them alive. Companies like Atlas Games, which was a role-playing game publisher, tried their hand at it. Steve Jackson Games, made Illuminati, their pre-existing card game, into a collectible card game.
So just Illuminati was so good. That was such a great game.
Yeah, exactly. And they evolved it through the same collectible model. Now, what I'm interested in is, we've sort of touched on it before, TSR, obviously they made Spellfire, and I've also been lucky enough to talk to Stephen E. Shen, who also created their other Planescape CCG, Blood Wars. They actually made two collectible card games in that sort of first 2 years. Now, tell me about how these games, especially Spellfire, affected TSR's business. Like, obviously, we were talking about how you can only sell a role-playing game once, but collectible card games don't have that issue. Did TSR see some sort of success or increase in business because of the collectible game model that apparently was ruining the industry?
Oh, I mean, and again, a deep irony. And again, that comment that collectible card games are ruining the industry is just lashing out. It's just like throwing an insult, because again, the thing that I was told by numerous sources was you had Spellfire releases selling really well. They would be bringing in millions of dollars in gross. And again, that gross, when you consider that you spent no money on it, like that's got to be a game that is massively in the black. No new art. You didn't need to hire any game designers. All the game designers were on staff. Yeah, there's printing costs, but again, they printed in vast bulk. So I'm assuming the printing costs were fairly reasonable. And it grossed millions and millions of dollars. So again, the deep irony here, I would say, is looking at it through just a CCG lens. You had the CEO of the company complaining about collectible card games while selling collectible card games that kept the company afloat because it was so much more profitable than role-playing games.
And interesting to the point that we haven't really talked about this, and let's lead into it because I think it's a really fascinating story for not just CCG players or RPG players, but for anybody interested in gaming business. CCGs, unlike the books, weren't returnable to TSR. So whatever they sold, that was pure profit. But unlike that, some of their books that they sold, which we'll get into when we talk about sort of what led to TSR's sort of financial trouble throughout the 90s, it sort of absolved them. So not only was it something that was profiting for them, it also didn't have the trouble that the other product lines that they were making also had. Now, obviously, we could talk about briefly before we go into the financial trouble there, or maybe it leads into it. They also tried their hand at another collectible game in a different format, which was Dragon Dice, which was a little bit tricky. So do you want to tell us what Dragon Dice is?
So Dragon Dice, I think you did a great job explaining. It was a collectible dice game. And I want to say it was designed by Lester Smith, and again, it was very well reviewed, very well received. But one of the it was cited to me actually as an example of mismanagement, in that there was a Gen Con where they wanted to launch Dragon Dice, and for whatever reason, their Hong Kong manufacturers did not get the dice done on time to get them to Gen Con. So the solution was to ship the product by air instead of by boat to get it to Gen Con in time. But that was so expensive that it apparently ate up any profitability in the game. And suddenly this game that seemed very promising got pushed into the red. People would tell me things like TSR died a death of 1,000 cuts. And that, they just kept making a lot of mistakes like that. And again, this would be we got to get to Gen Con in time to make an impression on people. But that would have been great if you could have done it without destroying the profitability of the game. But they just destroyed the profitability of the game to get it there.
Again, those toxic business practices sort of seem to rear their head. Now, it would have been fascinating to know that there might have been an alternative or, darker or even lighter timeline where Dragon Dice is a successful launch. And, it creates this whole genre of, dice games, a second fad, if you will, that sort of followed Magic the Gathering sort of lead as the collectible, the CDG or something like that. Because nowadays we have games like, it's no longer with us, but, Star Wars Destiny, which was a dice and card game hybrid, or even Dice Masters, I think, or Quarriors, some of those games where it is a collectible dice game as well as some card components as well. So it would be really fascinating to know if they had managed that a little bit differently, if there was an opportunity there that they actually failed to capture. Now, we sort of mentioned that, they died of 1,000 cuts, but there is one especially big wound that they were bleeding from, and that was returns that we mentioned before. Let's jump into why TSR sort of went from being this big dog in the yard to, not just through sales, but through poor business practices, became this, this whimpering sort of aging sort of, hound that needed to be put down. Tell us all about what sort of led to that big return in TSR's history and why they were financially hurting by the time 1996 rolled around.
Yeah, this was the most shocking thing I think I learned. I learned it very early on, and it's kind of what drove me to write the book. And that was that TSR had a relationship with its distributor to the book trade, Random House, where TSR could ship product to Random House and then receive payment on that product within 30 days, whether or not Random House sold it. So the printing of product for TSR became the printing of money in many ways. And initially, there were good reasons for that relationship in the early 80s that made a ton of sense. But by the 90s, TSR was abusing the contract to generate loans to keep itself afloat. And this pile of debt began to stack at Random House, and it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And as this debt is growing, the product in Random House's warehouse is also piling up and piling up and piling up. And one day in the autumn of 1996, someone at Random House looked at their warehouse and was like, "Holy crap, we got an awful lot of TSR D&D product here. Let's return it." And now the returns are significant, not from a financial sense because TSR had already been paid for them, so they were already on the hook for these loans. The return, however, represented a denial to TSR of the ability to even pretend that those games were going to move. It was almost a way of Random House saying, we think you're screwed on this end. And again, it's a very dramatic thing that people have talked about. The funny thing is a lot of TSR employees are like, we didn't even notice when it happened. Like it was just another return. The warehouse worked a little longer that day. We thought everything was fine. So stuff's coming back from Random House, whatever. But really it was the again, denial that those things could ever sell. And the fact that they'd already been paid for them. And I want to say in 97, 96, I think they were at $10 million they owed Random House, which for a company like TSR is very structured the way it was, would have been almost impossible to pay down. When they did try and pay it down, they only paid down like $1 million in like a year, which was not what they were supposed to do.
Oh, absolutely. Like, obviously, by the end of that, by the time, in your book, you sort of painted as a folk hero, but by the time previous guest of the show, Peter Atkinson, flies in, they've got $30 million in debt. They are suffering. And by the time the sale goes through, essentially most of that money goes to paying back that debt. So let's rewind a little bit. Let's learn. Obviously, they were in this wounded state. They were bleeding out. They needed to be put down, for lack of a better term. And I'm sorry for anybody who loves TSR. Obviously, there was some of those misplays that they definitely took. I'm sure board gamers know that feeling. CCG players know that feeling of a misplay. But, this happened on a corporate scale. But let's talk about how TSR, in a broad sense, ended up becoming, I hate to use this word, but sort of absorbed or gobbled up as if it was a gelatinous cube that is Wizards of the Coast absorbed TSR. So let's start from that story, sort of from the beginning, because it's really fascinating that doesn't just involve Wizards of the Coast that everybody knows, but two CCG companies, the two sort of foremost original CCG companies at the time, working together to sort of bring TSR into Wizards of the Coast, which ultimately had a great effect for gamers and solved some of the problems we talked about. So I want to hear your perspective, the full tale of how, the wizard tames the dragon, so to speak.
That's a good one. So I would start with Peter Adkison actually approaching Lorraine Williams about buying TSR. I don't recall what year this was, but Wizards was doing so well at this point that the board was like, hey, we don't want to just sit on this pile of money. Peter, take the money and make more money with it. We expand. So he went to Lorraine Williams and he was like, hey, can I buy TSR? And she was like, no, we're fine. You can't buy us. Okay. Months pass. I think also it's possible that at the same that happened at Gen Con, that Atkinson was like, hey, I'll buy a TSR. And she was like, no. She may have also sued Wizards of the Coast at that same Gen Con.
To little avail, I'm sure.
Yeah, that is fair to say. And like the lawsuit was incredibly smarmy, which is like the hallmark of TSR's marketing and legal departments. And also unremembered by Peter Adkison when I was like, do you remember when they sued you? They did it several times and never really impressed me. And it was like they sued for 30 grand or something ridiculously tiny.
That's not even lawyer fees, I don't think, for most of their team.
Yeah, it's nothing. So the first thing that happens is a rejection because Lorraine Williams supposedly loathed Peter. Then in the winter of 1997, TSR suddenly stops putting out product.
Which to that date had never happened before. They'd always been consistent, right?
They put out product like clockwork for complicated legal reasons that you can hear about in my book.
And I recommend you do.
But Bob Abramowitz, who was the CEO of Five Rings Publishing at that time, he noticed this, and he had worked in the sales department at TSR about 15 years earlier. He meets with Lorraine and he's like, hey, I can't help but notice you haven't put anything out in the past 2 months. And that's really unusual. Is there a problem? And if so, maybe we could help you out by buying it. She asks him to come to Lake Geneva with the team, which was a lawyer and Ryan Dancy,
who some might know as another member of Five Rings Publishing Group and one of the co-creators of Legend of the Five Rings, not just the CCG, but of course, the franchise and the RPG and everything like that.
Legend of the Five Rings is one of my favorite role-playing games, and I spent an awful lot of time talking to Ryan Dancy, and I can't believe I've never talked to him about Legend of the Five Rings, and all the times I've talked to him. But they find a sick company, a company that's $30 million in debt, a company that is at war with its distributor Random House over debt, a company that had stopped paying its printer, and the printer had therefore stopped printing materials for them. And they leave Lake Geneva after a long weekend. No, it was like 2 or 3 days, with a letter of intent that would have allowed Five Rings Publishing to purchase TSR.
Yeah.
But there was no way Five Rings Publishing at that moment in time could actually afford to buy TSR. Now, either Bob Abramowitz had one answer and Ryan Dancy had another. One of them said they thought they could have done it eventually. The other said no way. But either way, the price tag was so big that it seemed impossible for Five Rings to swing it. So Bob Abramowitz contacts Peter Adkison and says, hey, do you want to get in on this deal to buy TSR? And Peter Adkison is like, yes, I do. Okay, well, the only way you can do it is by also buying Five Rings Publishing, giving everybody jobs, at least for a little while. So then Peter Adkison is brought into the deal. He goes to Lake Geneva to negotiate with Lorraine Williams. By the end of the negotiate, like Peter Adkison, again, being the nicest guy in the geek industry, didn't have a single bad word to say about Lorraine Williams. He said that negotiating her was neither bad nor good, and he tried to be respectful of her. And by the end of it, people did tell me that they thought Lorraine had come to at least respect Peter. She threw a dinner in his honor at her home. And apparently there was an adults table and a kids table. And at the kids table were the game designers and Lisa Stevens and the Wizards of the Coast people. And the adult table was Peter, Lorraine, and all these other business folks. But still, it must have gone okay if by the end she was throwing parties for him at her house.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, even when you're stuck down a well, you could hate the guy who pulls you out, but you're still going to give him a hug.
Wizards of the Coast was so flush with cash at this point in their history, and I'd imagine they're only flusher now. They did not need to borrow money to buy TSR. They could just do it out of ready cash. Like there's just money pouring in the door. They just shunt some of it off to Lake Geneva, and boom, they now own TSR and D&D.
And isn't that interesting to go back to what we were saying before about the scale of difference of the purchase power of a CCG versus an RPG? You know, like the debts and the price to buy the entire thing was not literally, but obviously metaphorically chump change to Wizards of the Coast by that point, who weren't even publishing role-playing games then.
And again, it's the nature of the product, right? To keep up with Magic the Gathering. Like, can I ask, how much do you think you spend on Magic in a year?
Oh, I'm way less than it used to be. But I mean, in a typical year, way back at the time, literally $3,000 easy.
Wow.
That's conservative. That's pretty. And if you broaden that out, it'd probably be another 1,000 for other CCGs. Maybe I'm incorporating all CCGs in that. Let's say 3.5 for all CCGs in a year in my boom years. Actually, that doesn't count buying full collections as well. Let's get off this topic because my girlfriend might hear this episode.
This is so illuminating and enlightening. So because of the structure of the demand for CCGs, yeah, I mean, it's very easy for Wizards to purchase TSR, and a lot of the staff that do transition over, they really still think of D&D as being better in some fundamental way than Magic. It's older, it's more recognizable brand, and yet Magic gets all the heat because it brings in all the money. So it's an interesting thing. I'll get into that in volume 2, assuming there's a volume 2.
Well, it is that interesting push and pull of imagination, creativity versus finance and stuff like that. And again, it goes back to that spectrum I mentioned earlier about the rich kids game. Is this really a game, or is it a game of skill, or is it a game of money? It is a complicated question, and definitely not something we have time to talk about. So let's bring it to the conclusion of sort of what happens with sort of Wizards of the Coast and TSR. Sort of you've got Peter buying this company, all of a sudden absorbing a role-playing game company into a company that had divested itself years earlier of all role-playing games. What's sort of the epilogue of this story? What happens with sort of TSR, what happens with Wizards of the Coast, and what happens with D&D in those sort of middling years before sort of, they make their first big release.
Ultimately, the result is a renaissance of D&D. You could argue that they saved the game. Like, probably Lorraine Williams saved the game in 1985 when she bought it away from Gary Gygax. Probably Peter saved the game when he bought it in 1997. Because again, the sales were abysmal. And third edition, which came out 3 years later, was so good that it not only made existing fans happy, but seems to have created more. I do not have my sales numbers all end in 98, I think. So I can't tell you about the sales numbers for third edition. Hopefully somebody has those in their basement and sends them to me for the next book. That's what I hope happens.
Anybody listening, there's a request there. Now, there is something I do want to mention about third edition that also made it really special in the hindsight of not just the fact that it was owned by Wizards of the Coast, but something really brave that sort of, I think Peter was really in charge of. We didn't get a chance to talk about it when he was on this show, but third edition also came with the ability to sort of open the floodgates for other RPG publishers via a special agreement they entered into. Tell the audience, who is, like I said, mostly a CCG audience, about what that is.
So imagine, CCG audience, that one day Disney said, you know what? Anybody can make a Star Wars or Marvel movie. Like, with maybe but you know what? You can't use anybody from the originals, from the Skywalker saga. You just can't use any of those characters, but you can go make a Star Wars movie with the Empire, the Rebel Alliance, set it on Tatooine, just no Princess Leia, no Luke Skywalker. That is what Wizards of the Coast did with Dungeons and Dragons. They had created something called the Open Gaming License, which said that anybody could create material for Dungeons and Dragons within certain limits, publish them independently, and not have to run it by Wizards of the Coast. They did not have to send them money. They didn't have to send them royalties, nothing. Not a red cent went to Wizards of the Coast. And this created a huge role-playing game boom. Because third edition was popular and people wanted material for it. And this was pushed by, it was suggested, I want to say, by Scaff Elias, who was a magic designer, I think, initially.
Yeah, so just a little brief history on Scaff Elias. He was one of the first ever playtesters of Magic the Gathering and a friend of Richard Garfield, who helped him sort of develop the game in its earliest years.
Oh, that's really interesting. I want to say he came up with the idea for the Open Gaming License, but Ryan Dancy, who at this point was essentially the D&D brand manager at Wizards of the Coast, he was like, okay, this is our game plan. Our game plan is we're going to have an amazing third edition, and we are going to vault D&D to even further dominance through the use of the Open Gaming License, which, even though it means that we're not going to create as much stuff, but our game will still be bigger because other people will be creating stuff for us. It seemed very successful with third edition. When the fourth edition of D&D came along and was not as popular, it did allow people to keep making material for third edition, a game called Pathfinder, which eclipsed D&D for a few years. Then fifth edition came out and it was very popular, and the OGL again seems to be launching D&D to new prominence. So you could, depending on where you stop the story, the OGL seems like a great idea or a dumb idea. The 20 years after, but it must say something about the revolutionary quality of the idea that 20 years later, we're still sitting here going, so was that a mistake or was it brilliant? I can't tell. I still can't tell.
I think my personal opinion is it is brilliant. And one of the things I like to frame it in is, it was done by Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast early RPG history, we are a little off topic here, I'm sorry, CCG audience, but I just want to talk about this. There is something that's really fascinating, because Wizards of the Coast, way back in the earliest days of their company, was actually sued for making what was called a capstone game, or what they called a capstone game, where they would put characters, a multitude of characters, into different RPG systems. And in their case, it was Primal Order. You could play different gods, and it would work with not only Dungeons and Dragons, but also, Call of Cthulhu, or, the Palladium games or whatever. And one of the companies actually sued them for the fact that they had included their, company name in this list of things that you could use their product with without permission. And ultimately, I think that the irony there is Wizards of the Coast, whether it was Scaff Elias's idea, whether it was whoever's idea, ultimately ended up shepherding the idea that everybody could make a capstone game, and ultimately were responsible for that other RPG boom that I'm absolutely fascinated with. Because, we talked before about how, TSR really struggled with those toxic business practices, and all those other sort of, dogs were sort of biting at their thing. Vampire was taking away its audience. Mage the Ascension was taking away its audience. All the other games, Call of Cthulhu was taking away its audience, all from D&D. But what Wizards of the Coast did is put D&D in the center and then say, hey, whatever else you want, we don't have to deal with it, but you can just drink from our well. And I think that was a fantastic, fantastic idea in the history of role-playing games.
I think that's a very valid point. And again, maybe it's the historian in me, because I'm like, what's going to happen with the OGL next? Like, again, there's going to be there's a next D&D coming up called D&D 1, which they claim will be the end of all editions. And I'm like, also, some of the most recent D&D releases have not been inspiring a ton of confidence.
Now, that's another story, and I encourage other people to go look into the most recent box set from D&D. But anyway, we might be digressing there.
we probably are. And again, all I guess I want to say is, I am kind of like, so what happens if D&D 1 comes along and people are like, man, 5th edition was just better. I'm just going to keep playing 5th edition. Again, is the OGL then going to be like, is the OGL, maybe it's that the OGL is great when D&D is good, but when D&D is less than perfect, then it suddenly becomes this stalking horse, which allows another company to wear the mantle of D&D for a while. But now I'm really rambling on.
What's really interesting about that is, D&D has the problem that CCG sort of solved with rotating formats. Magic the Gathering for many years rotated their standards so that you had to keep up with the latest thing. But because D&D is all just people playing in their lounge rooms, there isn't, tournaments, so to speak, in the sort of Magic or CCG sense. Nobody is forced to buy, this next product or anything like that. They can continue. I mean, there are still people playing, AD&D 1 games,
Oh, yeah. And again, that is the both the amazing thing and the horrible thing about the role-playing game. Like, again, I love Legend of the Five Rings, and I have my Legend of the Five Rings collection just here to the left of my computer screen. And I have pretty much everything for the 1st edition, pretty much everything for the 4th edition, and I think one book from the editions in between. Because again, I was like, 2nd edition, 3rd edition come out, and I'm like, not impressed, don't love it. I'm just going to stick with my 1st edition stuff. 4th edition comes along, and I'm like, this is amazing. This is the best version ever. Buy everything for it. And now there's another edition, which technically would be called 5th, and I bought nothing for it again. But which again, but that's wonderful, right? Like, I can just keep playing the game the way I like it. But FFG, which controls the license for it right now, like, they're probably like, why can't I make this guy buy it? He likes it so much, but he can keep playing his old books. So it really does bedevil the financial side of the equation.
And what's interesting there is, I just want to draw a parallel for the CCG, or especially Magic players listening, is Magic has sort of pivoted in the last couple of years to this sort of what's called an eternal format of Commander, where people can play one of every card from any time in history, and sort of eschewing that sort of standard rotation. And I think the knock-on effect from that is the fact that means the company has to continue to make more and more powerful cards each set, because the majority of their player base are just playing with the cards that they want to. So if they're not putting out these super powered cards each and every set, it means that they're not getting the same sales that they would, because a lot of their base is, content with their deck. If they bring out a set and it's like, oh, there's nothing here that pushes my deck forward, I'm just going to ignore this set. And that certainly happened in the years past. Again, now I'm digressing. I'm so sorry. Again, that is another episode and another conversation with probably somebody else at this point. But I do want to say thank you so much, Ben, for joining me. It has been a pleasure revisiting some of the history that you have told me today, not just today as well, also the hours and hours I spent in airports reading your book. It was an absolute fascinating, eye-opening tale. There was so many stories in there that I had not heard, everything from people falling through roofs to lighting themselves on fire. It was absolutely crazy. So thank you so much. Before you go, please let us know everything you're working on at the moment. I will definitely make sure everything is linked in the description.
So my pleasure. Again, pick up my book somewhere if you are within the sound of my voice.
Or have access to Amazon.
Yeah. Again, I'm functionally a first-time author, so picking up the book, rating, reviewing, and telling other people about it is huge. I do have a podcast of longstanding called Plot Points, and on my blog, I am writing right now about historical documents from role-playing game history that I kind of couldn't cover in the book because they just weren't relevant. But again, it's juicy stuff like Peter Adkison turning down the co-creator of D&D for a job when he bought the company in 1997. And that's at writerbenriggs.com. The podcast is called Plot Points, and my book is Slaying the Dragon.
All of that will be linked in the description. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
I also post D&D sales numbers on Twitter.
Again, that'll be linked in the description, and I follow that as well. And I probably shouldn't let this go, but that's the only account I have notified with that bell, because I got to know when those numbers come down, because it fascinates me so.
I appreciate it. This has been terrific. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic. Now, remember, if you want to check out any of Ben's work, check the links in the description. It has been an absolute pleasure. If you're, if you've got no idea about RPGs, even this book is a great introduction to some of the earliest history. If you just like gaming, because RPGs didn't just influence, CCGs or whatever. They influenced so many video games. So many different forms of gaming have grown out of what Dungeons and Dragons started way back in 1974. All right, that's it for us for this other episode of Rare Slot. Thank you so much for joining us. One last time, goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, Ben.
Bye-bye.
And until next time, remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, the first standalone episode of Rare Slot. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you so much to Ben for telling all of those tales that he has learned throughout his digging through TSR and role-playing history. I couldn't be more impressed with the stuff that he said, and I can't wait for that next book that he was teasing throughout the episode. Now, please go check out anything that Ben mentioned there at the end about what he's doing. He's got a fantastic blog. He's got a great Twitter. He's also got his podcast, and of course, Slaying the Dragon, which again, I'm going to say it umpteenth time, I cannot recommend it enough. If you're interested in the sort of stuff we discussed today, please go check it out. It is a fantastic and riveting read. And if you're only interested in the CCG side of things, it can be very interesting as well, because I'm not a huge role-playing game player, but I found it fascinating nonetheless. Just if you're interested in the sort of stuff that I talk about on the show, there are some gaming stories in there that I just cannot believe actually happened, especially in this hobby that we love. Sometimes business stories are absolutely reserved for big business, high flyers. We've all seen Wolf of Wall Street and stuff, but there's some fascinating stories that would make a fantastic movie in that book. Now, as for me, I've been Rands. Go find me on social media. That is at CCG History on Facebook and Twitter, or twitter.com/CCG History, or facebook.com/CCG History. You can also send us an email if you have any feedback, as we mentioned in the introduction, or any sort of comments about the new format or anything you'd like to see. You can let us know via that email or direct message on either of those social medias. Also, if you have a look further down in the description or in the show notes of this episode, you're of course going to find our listener survey. Now, that listener survey may not be updated for the new network yet. It may still just be the old one, but feel free to drop in there and let us know what kind of things you want to hear on the channel, or give us some feedback or anything you want to let us know. I would appreciate that 1,000 times over. Now, the other thing I will mention is, I mention them every time, but our sponsor, which is Category 1 Games. If you're interested in any games, even things like Spellfire, Blood Wars, the old TSR CCGs, or Netrunner or something like that, go check them out, because they specialize not just in collectible card games, but classic collectible card games as well. And they have over 200 different classic collectible card games hosted on their website. They've also got fair market pricing and great customer service. So go check them out if you're able to, and if you're interested in anything like that. All right, that's been it for me. Thank you once more, and once more thank you to Ben. I cannot wait to bring you more content for this standalone show, Rare Slot, and the other things on the booster pack. We mentioned a couple of them in there, but go check out the old archive booster pack episode with Jim Ward. Go check out actually our very first episode, which features John Zinzer telling a completely different side of that TSR acquisition story from Wizards of the Coast. In fact, he was in Five Rings Publishing Group at the time, and he tells an amazing tale there. That's our very first episode. You can go check that out. All right, that's it from me. Thank you so much. Until next time, remember, I've said it once, and I'll say it again, as I always do, keep shuffling.